Throughout history, science has pushed the limits of human understanding, but in that pursuit of knowledge, some researchers and even governments crossed lines that should have never been crossed. Behind closed doors, people became test subjects. Some experiments were cruel, others horrifying, and many of them left scars that lasted a lifetime. These aren't theories, rumors, or even urban legends. They're documented cases, projects hidden away in forgotten files, experiments buried in academic journals, and testimonies from those who lived through them. What happens when morality is stripped away in the name of science, when the pursuit of answers comes at the cost of human suffering? Today we're diving into some of the most disturbing psychological experiments ever conducted. And before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know. Let's begin. And a quick disclaimer before we get into the video. Everything mentioned in this video is for educational purposes only. Everything stated is fact available in the public record, with no personal opinions, theories, biases, or conjecture. This video covers sensitive topics. Please watch with caution. MK Ultra. In the middle of the Cold War, the CIA set out to control the human mind. They didn't care about safety or ethics, only results. It became one of the most disturbing psychological programs in history, remembered today by a single code name: MK Ultra. It was a covert CIA umbrella program that pushed the boundaries of the human psyche, and though most documents were destroyed, a lot still exists through the public record. Enough to understand how terrifying this program was at its peak. To put it simply, MK Ultra was a program headed by the Technical Services Division, or TSD for short. It was the root of 149 other sub-projects, all of which were involved in researching drugs, interrogation methods, behavior modification, and incapacitation, all of which were tested on unaware human subjects. It was the world's first sophisticated truth serum. In their own words, MK Ultra was essentially created to control human behavior. It was authorized by the director of the CIA at the time, Mr. Allen W. Dulles. In 1953, the TSD was told to allocate 20% of their research and development budget solely to MK Ultra. Millions went into this program, and even more was completely unaccounted for. They waived the usual procedure when it came to approving funding for projects like these, and everything was off the books. Only 2 individuals from the entire TSD knew everything, and almost everything they did know was entirely undocumented. There are just 2 individuals in TSD who have full substantive knowledge of the program, and most of that knowledge is unrecorded. Both are highly skilled, highly motivated, professionally competent individuals. Part of their competence lies in their command of intelligence tradecraft, in protecting the sensitive nature of the American intelligence capability to manipulate human behavior. They apply need-to-know doctrine to their professional associates and to their clerical assistants to a maximum degree. Confidence in their competence and discretion has been a vital feature of the management of MK Ultra. Before MK Ultra, the CIA began studying communist brainwashing techniques, funding huge research projects. They called it QK Hilltop. QK Hilltop was a cryptonym assigned in 1954 to a project to study Chinese communist brainwashing techniques and to develop interrogation techniques. Most of the early studies are believed to have been conducted by the Cornell University Medical School Human Ecology study programs. The effort was absorbed into the MK Ultra program, and the QK Hilltop cryptonym became obsolete. The Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, later the Human Ecology Fund, was an outgrowth of the QK Hilltop. MK Ultra wasn't your run-of-the-mill testing program. A squeaky clean lab? Doctors and scientists in white lab coats with clipboards? No. Prior consent was obviously not obtained from any of the subjects. There was also, obviously, no medical pre-screening. In addition, the tests were conducted by individuals who were not qualified scientific observers. There were no medical personnel on hand either to administer the drugs or to observe their effects, and no follow-up was conducted on the test subjects. Operation Midnight Climax was a safe house program, where the CIA used apartments in huge cities such as San Francisco and New York, employing prostitutes to lure in targets. In short, the apartments used in this sub-project were nicknamed CIA brothels. These targets were dosed without their consent through a number of ways. Whether that was a literal needle, an aerosol agent, you name it, they've probably done it. And rather elaborate decorations were added, as I understand at least, to the one in San Francisco, in the bedroom, which are French can-can dancers, floral pictures, drapery, including installation of bedroom mirrors, 3 framed Toulouse-Lautrec posters with black silk mats, and a number of other red bedroom curtains and recording equipment, and then a series of documents which were provided to the committee, which indicate a wide proliferation of different cash for $100, generally in the $100 range over any period of time on the particular checks. Even the names are blocked out as to the person who is receiving it. Cash for undercover agents, operating expenses, drinks, entertainment while administrating, and then it is dashed out. What can you tell us that it might suggest to you about what techniques were being used by the agency in terms of reaching that sort of broad-based group of Americans that are being evidently enticed for testing in terms of drugs and others? Do you draw any kind of conclusion about what might have been going on out there in these safe houses? They'd use two-way mirrors to watch the effects that MK Ultra had on subjects, with recording devices in the rooms. MK Ultra testing branched out into Montreal, Canada, under Sub-Project 68, where they began testing something called psychic driving. Funds were diverted through the Society for the Investigations of Human Ecology, Inc., with barely any accounting for funds at all. The fund-approved memo mentioned 5 different drugs to be used on human subjects, either on their own or in a combination: artane, enectine, bulbocapnine, curare, and the classic LSD. The major red flags in these drugs are enectine, bulbocapnine, curare, and of course LSD. All those drugs, except LSD, are used to induce short-term paralysis. LSD, however, is one of the most notorious drugs out there. Being one of the most potent hallucinogens, was used to literally shape the reality of whoever they used it on. Using this combination of substances, Sub-Project 68 was trying to literally shift the reality of each subject that MK Ultra was used on, hence the term psychic driving. But one question stays prevalent: how and why did MK Ultra even come to be? In 1949, once the CIA received intelligence of communist brainwashing of prisoners of war, the CIA approved the Blue Bird program. And a year later, it approved Artichoke, which ended up superseding it. Artichoke was the early stages of understanding how to use drugs and hypnosis for interrogation. On April 10, 1953, director Alan Dulles gave a speech at the National Alumni Conference of Princeton University. The speech was titled Brain Warfare, announcing how Cold War tensions were rising and that the battle had shifted from a Cold War to brain warfare. 2 days later, on April 13, 1953, MK Ultra was authorized. Almost nothing was revealed to the public about this, and over time, 149 sub-projects took place. Then finally, the first recorded death. It is crucial, as several files pertaining to MK Ultra were destroyed, and record-keeping was notoriously lackluster, intentionally done so. The most tragic result of the testing of LSD by the CIA was the death of Dr. Frank Olson, a civilian employee of the Army who died on November 27, 1953. His death followed his participation in a CIA experiment with LSD. As part of this experiment, Olson unwittingly received approximately 70 micrograms of LSD in a glass of Cointreau he drank on November 19, 1953. The drug had been placed in the bottle by a CIA officer, Dr. Robert Lashbrook. As part of an experiment he and Dr. Sidney Gottlieb performed at a meeting of Army and CIA scientists. Shortly after this experiment, Olson exhibited symptoms of paranoia and schizophrenia. Accompanied by Dr. Lashbrook, Olson sought psychiatric assistance in New York City from a physician, Dr. Harold Abstrom, whose research on LSD had been funded indirectly by the CIA. While in New York for treatment, Olson fell to his death from a 10th-story window in the Statler Hotel. The death brought in safeguards, but testing did not slow down in the slightest, and if anything, it only started ramping up. Operation Midnight Climax began just months after Dr. Olson's death. This way, the entire environment was under the CIA's control. Not long after, Subproject 68 began, where the first records of specific drugs were being noted. MKUltra ran unchecked until 1963, where the CIA Inspector General issued a top-secret report on MKUltra. The report was entirely internal, yet posed questions on the unwitting drug tests and pushed for ethical constraints on research. The concepts involved in manipulating human behavior are found by many people, both within and outside the agency, to be distasteful and unethical. The principal conclusions of the inspection are that the structure and operation controls over this activity need strengthening. Improvements are needed in the administration of the research projects, and some of the testing of substances under simulated operational conditions was judged to involve excessive risk to the agency. Another report emphasized the extreme expenditure of the MKUltra program. Funding of MKUltra was eventually stabilized at 20% of TDS's annual research and developmental budget. It has fallen in the neighborhood of redacted per year over the 10-year history of the program. The report finally reveals just how far the CIA went with MKUltra. Over the 10-year life of the program, many additional avenues to the control of human behavior have been designated by the TSD management as appropriate to investigation under the MKUltra Charter, including radiation, electroshock, various fields of psychology, psychiatry, sociology, and anthropology, graphology, harassment substances, and paramilitary devices and materials. MKUltra eventually evolved into MK Search after this report from the Inspector General. MK Search was the name given to the continuation of the MKUltra program. Funding commenced in FY 1966 and ended in FY 1972. Its purpose was to develop, test, and evaluate capabilities in the covert use of biological, chemical, and radioactive material systems and techniques for producing predictable human behavioral and/or psychological changes in support of highly sensitive operational requirements. The experiments continued until around a year or two later when the Midnight Climax safe houses were closed. Although experimentation had concluded, the program kept going for 6 more years, until 1972, when it was finally closed. This is when the CIA realized how far they'd gone. In January 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of MKUltra files and documents. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the fact that the extent of experimentation on human subjects was unknown. The records of all these activities were destroyed in January 1973 at the instruction of then CIA Director Richard Helms. In spite of persistent inquiries by both of the Health Subcommittee and the Intelligence Committee, no additional records or information were forthcoming, and no single individual could be found who remembered the details. Not the director of the CIA, who ordered the documents destroyed, not the official responsible for the program, nor any of his associates. The MKUltra program was summed up in one paragraph by Senator Kennedy. The Central Intelligence Agency drugged American citizens without their knowledge or consent. It used university facilities and personnel without their knowledge. It funded leading researchers, often without their knowledge. 2 years later, the Rockefeller Commission and the Church Committee investigate the CIA and the MKUltra program, where for the first time in 25 years, it becomes public knowledge. President Ford apologizes to the family of Dr. Olson for his death and the CIA direct involvement. On February 18, 1976, President Ford finally signed Executive Order 11905. Intelligence agencies shall not engage in experimentation with drugs on human subjects except with the informed consent, in writing and witnessed by a disinterested third party, of each such human subject and in accordance with the guidelines issued by the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects for Biomedical and Behavioral Research. Eventually, after a Freedom of Information Act request was hammered through by a member of the public, the CIA ended up finding over 7 boxes worth of financial MKUltra records. Approximately 20,000 pages escaped the destruction order by Director Helms. Another FOIA request was placed, questioning the redaction of several statements within MKUltra files, which led to a court case being filed. CIA v. Sims held that disclosure of certain parts within these files was justified on the grounds that private contractors and scientists worked on the program and redaction was necessary to protect their identities. In 1992, the Canadian government announced compensation for victims of the Montreal experiments, and finally, MKUltra came to a close. What's commonly misunderstood is that the CIA did in fact invent reliable mind control, when this was far from the truth. Results were all over the place and couldn't be trusted. It's also said that people were programmed by the CIA to carry out assassinations when that was fundamentally impossible. Although the mind control program had seen some scattered results, that's all they were: scattered. To this day, it's unclear just how much we don't know about MKUltra. With the amount of data in all the published documents, this is barely scratching the surface of just how bad MKUltra was. MKUltra was nothing more than a messy attempt to win the Cold War through the most unethical means possible, and to create an entirely new subset of warfare, through mental warfare. MKUltra is a huge operation that had hundreds of subprojects running simultaneously. This video only covers the surface level of what it actually is. Please let me know in the comments down below if you want to see a bigger video covering more subprojects, going even further in depth to what MKUltra is and the extent to which the project went to with its 149 subprojects. Little Albert. These days, before conducting any study, it has to go through a strict ethics board where a series of judges grill the author before allowing it to be carried out. But at least until the end of the 20th century, there was no such barrier, and researchers, in the name of science, could carry out whatever study they wanted, no matter how unethical. One example is the disturbing Little Albert experiment by John B. Watson and his graduate student, Rosalie Rayner, studying at Johns Hopkins University. The results were first published in the February issue of the Journal of Experimental Psychology in 1920. This study was thought to be evidence of classical conditioning by psychologists of that time. You might have heard of Pavlov's dog, or the word Pavlovian, which is the most famous example of classical conditioning. It basically refers to the process where a biological stimulus, such as food, is paired with a neutral stimulus that usually doesn't mean anything, such as a specific sound. In Pavlov's experiment, the biological stimulus is the food that they fed to the dogs, and the neutral stimulus is the appearance of the technician who fed them. Whenever the dogs saw the technician, they would start drooling, which is known as classical conditioning. Here, Watson thought that the scared response by children to a loud noise was natural, meaning that they were born with it and not conditioned. He wanted to test the idea that by using this unconditioned response, he could condition a child to fear something that would not normally be. Specifically, he wanted to condition a phobia into a regular baby. So they chose a 9-month-old infant from a hospital, which they named Albert. Watson also exactly copied the experiment Pavlov did with his dogs. First, Albert did a set of baseline tests to make sure that he wasn't already afraid of the objects they were trying to condition a phobia to, which were a white rat, a rabbit, a dog, a monkey, masks, cotton, and a variety of other materials. Albert was not afraid of any of these. By the time he was 11 months old, Watson and Rayner started the proper experiment. First, they placed a white lab rat in front of him, which little Albert played with happily. Then, they made a loud sound behind him by hitting a hammer onto a steel bar each time Albert touched the rat. Obviously, Albert was scared every time they made the sound and would respond by crying. Eventually, they stopped playing the sound and just put the rat in front of him. After seeing it, Albert would start crying and crawling away even though there was no sound, basically proving that Albert associated the noise to the rat. This continued in further experiments, and he would be scared of anything even similar to the rat. For example, he would become distressed when he saw some other furry objects, such as a rabbit or a furry dog. At the end of the experiment, Albert was a year old, and he left the hospital shortly. Watson considered trying to desensitize, but in the end, chose not to, and thought that his fear would stay with him even after the experiment. In the name of research, the two researchers deliberately inflicted psychological harm on an infant without any regard for the child's well-being or development. Without any concern for basic ethical principles, they left the child with potential long-lasting phobias that they did not even attempt to reverse or even provide some comfort. Just leaving after their experiment was done. It really shows the casual cruelty with which they treated an unnamed child and highlighted a shocking lack of ethical standards that we have today. Furthermore, the experiment did not even have anything useful, as a review by Ben Harris in 1979. He states, "Critical reading of Watson and Rayner's 1920 report reveals little evidence either that Albert developed a rat phobia or even that animals consistently evoked this fear or anxiety during Watson and Rayner's experiment. It may be useful for modern learning theorists to see how the Albert study prompted subsequent research, but it seems time, finally, to place the Watson and Rayner data in the category of interesting but uninterpretable results. There is no concrete evidence or maintained records of the exact experiments that happened, just a report by Watson and Rayner. There was a film, but it didn't show everything, and people interpret differently. It is unclear exactly what stimuli was used or how it affected him in each case. Watson didn't care to find out what happened to the child after the experiment, though the identity of little Albert was found later. Initially, they thought it was a child named Douglas Merritt, the son of Arvilla Merritt, who was a wet nurse at Harriet Lane Home. He sadly had hydrocephalus, which is where fluid builds up in the brain and causes pressure on it. The common symptoms are double vision or trouble seeing, which further derails the experiment. There were some signs of this, as Albert would use hand scooping instead of grasping, as is normal with babies of that age. He also supposedly had eye scanning abilities and was not very expressive, but this theory was later refuted. Others argued that it was actually a baby named Albert Barger who was born within a day of Douglas. His mother worked at the same hospital as the experiment was conducted at, and his size and weight matched the reported data. Most importantly, Watson and Rayner said that Albert was exactly 12 months and 21 days old on the day he was taken from the hospital, which is also the exact age Barger left the hospital. Around the same time, another researcher found out that Douglas was completely blind, so it definitely could not have been him, as little Albert could see things. Barger died in 2007 at 87 years old, and when his niece was interviewed, she said Barger was afraid of dogs and animals in general. His family would put dogs in another room whenever he visited. She said that he did not have any other phobias that she knew of. Researchers concluded that Barger was probably unaware of the experiments conducted on him. Unit 731. Before the Second World War, Imperial Japan had taken a very harsh turn to militarism and authoritarianism. Sado Arkai was leading the army party, and the country was set on a course for his rule of complete control and a laser focus on the war. Army units were created to compartmentalize and organize the forces of the shogun. One of these units was Unit 731, responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths, some of the worst ever human experimentation. This unit knew no boundaries, no humanity. Unit 731 was the hub of Imperial Japan's bio-warfare program, which ran experimentation and testing on humans more than anything else. It would take prisoners of war and run experiments on them, some of which would make your skin crawl. It was run by General Shiro Ishii initially, and later by Masashi Katano. They infected subjects with deadly infections, diseases, bacteria. They would carry out vivisections, subject the poor prisoners to frostbite, and test ballistics on them. All this and much, much worse. The prisoners of war that they experimented on were mainly Chinese civilians, along with Koreans, Russians, and anyone else they found suitable. Nobody was spared, not even women or children. Between 1932 and 1935, Ishii secured approval and funding for biological warfare research in Manchuria, after Imperial Japan had invaded them a year earlier in 1931. Human experimentation began prematurely in the fall of 1933. This experimentation took place in what was called the Togo Unit, a top-secret unit set up under the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army. They were essentially preliminary tests to find out whether or not human experimentation was actually feasible or not, and whether they were able to conduct human experiments in Northeast China. Everyone in this test unit were military doctors, but under false names and identities. Only 10 doctors were involved, with about 100 members of staff running the place. Between April to May 1936, Unit 731 was officially established. Evidently, after preliminary testing went well. A memo dated April 23, 1936 confirmed the establishment, and official testing began. By the 21st of May, everything was approved by the Emperor. Unit 731 moved their operational facilities to an established laboratory at a hospital, which now served as their temporary headquarters. A permanent headquarters was underway, being built at Pingfan. The staff changed from the original military doctors to private sector medical researchers, and the original Togo unit had a massive overhaul with its official establishment. Professors and instructors from Kyoto Imperial University were posted to 731 in an 8-person team formation. 2 bacteriologists, 3 pathologists, 2 physiologists, and 1 researcher. Until now, they'd all had experience working on animals. The team would expand as time passed, and by early 1939, another team had arrived at the facility. They expanded into Singapore. At the end of 1939, the human experimentation program was sophisticated between 4 distinct units. Unit 731 being the main headquarters, Unit 1644, Unit 8604, and Unit 9420. Before the Singapore unit was established, an internal survey accounted for 10,045 total staff spread across 3 units. As terrible as the crimes were, the operation was highly sophisticated, making MK Ultra look like a high school chemistry project in comparison. Human experimentation was cruel and varied greatly, but it was overall divided into 4 categories. First, deliberate infection. They needed to know how exactly the infections affected the human body, and research narrowed it down to the moments before death. Yuta Yatero was a lab technician assigned to extract blood from a human guinea pig before the material died. These were the exact terms they used on the humans they were experimenting on. Yuta had the prison guards force other prisoners to lift the dying man's arms so that he could begin his work. The man's hand was already turning purple and felt cold. Yuta observed that. More important to me than the man's death was the blood flowing in the human guinea pig's body at the moment before his death. Ultimately, he was able to obtain 10 cubic centimeters of blood as a sample. For people in laboratory work, this is ecstasy, and one's calling to his profession. He concluded his comments by saying, "Showing compassion for a person's death pains was of no value to me." When they had extracted every bit of use from these prisoners, the normal assumption is that they're released and given some sort of relief or treatment. When no longer of further use to the researchers, the prisoners would be executed, their bodies dissected, and burned in the unit's incinerators. They would test methods to cure diseases like malaria using these prisoners. Sought to discover a cure for malaria, in one experiment using 9 POWs as research subjects, he injected several of the men with malaria-contaminated blood extracted from Japanese soldiers suffering from the disease. These subjects were known to be malaria-free, and Hirano hoped to develop a technique that would prove immunity to malaria. He failed in this experiment. In another experiment, Hirano used blood from local villagers known to be immune to malaria and injected this blood into several other POWs thought to be malaria carriers. He told one of the prisoners that he wanted to see what would happen. 2 of the men died shortly after receiving the injections. They would also frequently perform vivisections on these prisoners. A vivisection, from Latin vivis, alive, and secto, cutting, is surgery conducted for experimental purposes on a living organism, typically animals with a central nervous system, to view living internal structure. Except these were not on animals. These vivisections were on alive human beings. They would try and research venereal diseases in forced prostitutes by cutting them open while they were actively infected with syphilis. Researchers investigating the problem of venereal diseases in comfort women, women forced into sexual service, used vivisection to learn about the various stages in the development of this infection. If the women didn't have syphilis, the doctors would inject them with it. And if the injection failed, failing to achieve results by injecting women with syphilis, the doctors turned to a system of direct infection through sexual contact. Prisoners, one of whom had been identified as suffering from syphilis, were forced to have intercourse and relations. The healthy partner's progress was monitored carefully. Once he or she became infected, the progress of the disease would be observed closely to determine, for example, how far it advanced the first week, the second week, and so forth. At a certain stage in their studies, the researchers engaged in live dissection to investigate how different internal organs are affected at different stages of the disease. But it didn't end there. Some of these experiments they did seemed as if they were purely for fun. 8 prisoners were used in these tests. 2 of the men had tourniquets tied tightly around their arms and their legs. The tourniquets were kept in place for 7 or 8 hours, interrupting blood circulation to the extremities. The 2 men died of shock within minutes after the tourniquets were removed from their limbs. They were dissected, and different portions of their bodies were examined. Dr. Iwanami kept the skulls as souvenirs. And reading all of this is just so jaw-dropping. How cruel and utterly morbid all of this experiment is, and just how insane it is. This was just the first category of experiments. The second category would include intentionally induced frostbite, with the controlled cooling of limbs in ice/salt water for frostbite and thermal studies. These studies were publicly published without any acknowledgement of the victims they conducted the experiments on. For the third category, they would shove prisoners in pressure chambers, test grenades on them, put them in gas trials, just to see how it would affect them. Finally, they would force pregnancies, force STDs, then see if the fetuses and eventual infants received the infections or not. Biological warfare trials began at the end of August after pathogens were spread in the Halston River. This water fed into one of the Soviet Army's water sources, except there was little to no effect. The pathogens they used ended up losing their infectivity once placed in water. The scientists knew this, but they carried out the attack with an eagerness to run a field test of bioweapons in combat. After all was said and done, only 1 Japanese soldier had been infected and died of typhoid fever. The following year, Unit 731 began cultivating more and more pathogens, shipping them to Unit 1644, which served as the forward base for field attacks. They would attack the Chang River, and one of the largest scale attacks they carried out was on the city of Ningbo on October 27, 1940. The Japanese army invaded Chinese airspace with heavy bombers at 7 a.m., flying low altitude as they dropped fleas, grain, and strips of cotton in the city center. The fleas were infected with the plague, having ingested blood from plague-infested rats. They were fittingly given the name plague fleas. They were dropped with grains and cotton to ensure that A, the attack would land at the target area, and that B, the subsequent shock from landing would be absorbed by the cotton. The first death took 4 days. After that, approximately 40 more people died in the following 2 days. The area was sealed off and quarantined by the time the Chinese realized it was an epidemic. By December 2nd, 106 people died. This was recorded as one of the most lethal attacks carried out on the Chinese cities, although objectively, it was a military failure. The risk that the Japanese took with their heavy bombers at such a low altitude of 100 deaths was simply not enough for payoff of 100 casualties, at least not for them. After several more defeats, everyone's patience was running out. The war was drawing through the middle, and a close was nearby. They needed something that would cause a devastating blow. The perfect bacteria bomb. By 1945, they had it ready. The plan, the bomb, the attack, everything was due to be set in motion. Operation Cherry Blossom at night was one of the most devastating attacks that never happened. Unit 731 perfected ceramic bombs, which were loaded with plague-infected fleas and other biowarfare agents. These Ishi bombs went into standardized production in 1944. They stuffed these bombs with the bubonic plague, cholera, typhus, dengue fever, and much, much more. This cocktail was a biological terror attack aimed at the citizens of the United States of America. The plan was finalized on March 26, 1944, but not long after faced internal hesitation. The Chief of General Staff explained that if bacteriological warfare is conducted, it will grow from the dimension of war between Japan and America to an endless battle of humanity against bacteria. Japan will earn the derision of the world. 7 months later, World War II ended, with Japan's surrender and the 2 atomic bombs being launched on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Unit 731 was covered up by the USA in exchange for the Japanese scientists sharing their findings. And I know this case or story I just shared isn't exactly just a psychological experiment, but they're experiments that are worth covering. And I just really wanted to cover it because I feel like Japan in World War II is not talked about enough. And especially at the end there with the USA covering up, Unit 731. It's crazy. And I don't know what other video I'd have put this in. I've been wanting to talk about it for a while, so I included it here. And it's just mind-blowing how much disgusting and morbid shit went on in World War II. On to the next one. The Monster Study. About 2 decades later, things really haven't changed. Another experiment called the Monster Study was conducted in Davenport, Iowa by Wendell Johnson, who was to nerd at the University of Iowa along with his graduate student, Mary Tudor. You'll soon find out why it deserved such a disturbing nickname. The University of Iowa was well known for their advancements in speech problems such as stuttering. Dr. Johnson was a stutterer himself and actually created the thesis for which this experiment was conducted. Basically, he believed that stuttering was purely psychological, stating that stuttering begins not in the child's mouth, but in the parent's ear. So he wanted to test this theory by trying to induce stuttering in children without any issues, and to stop stuttering in children by ignoring it and saying that they spoke fine. The 4 main questions they had were: will removing the label stutterer from those who have been labeled so have any effect on their speech fluency? Will endorsement of the label stutterer previously applied to an individual have any effect on their speech fluency? Will endorsement of the label normal speaker previously applied to an individual have any effect on their speech fluency? And will labeling a person previously regarded as a normal speaker a stutterer have any effect on their speech fluency? Disconcertingly, all the children they chose were orphans. First, they picked 256 children randomly, then judged them on their ability to speak from 1 poor to 5 fluent. In the end, 22 were chosen that were 5 years old to 16 years old. They were not told anything about the actual experiment, but instead said that they were going through speech therapy sessions. 10 of those who stuttered were divided into 2 equal groups: an experimental group who were told that their speech was fine, and the control group who actually went through speech therapy. The 12 normal speaking children were also divided into 2 equal groups: 6 who were told that their speech was horrible and were beginning to show symptoms of stuttering. They were not supposed to speak unless it was without stuttering. The other 6 were given compliments on their pronunciation. First, they tested the IQ of each child and whether they were right or left-handed, as it was thought at the time that stuttering could be caused by a cerebral imbalance. If you were left-handed but forcefully used your right hand, they thought that the nerve impulses would misfire and affect their speech. Obviously, we know that now that this is completely untrue. Then, every few weeks, Tudor, Johnson's graduate student, would come to the orphanage and talk to each child for 45 minutes. For the stuttering children in the experimental group, she would say, "You'll outgrow the stuttering, and you'll be able to speak even much better than you are speaking now. Pay no attention to what others say about your speaking ability, for undoubtedly, they do not realize that this is only a phase." To the non-stuttering students in the second experimental group, she said, "The staff has come to a conclusion that you have a great deal of trouble with your speech. You have many of the symptoms of a child who's beginning to stutter. You must try to stop yourself immediately. Use your willpower. Do anything to keep from stuttering. Don't ever speak unless you can do it right. You see how the name of a child in the institution who stuttered severely stutters, don't you? Well, he undoubtedly started this very same way." Of course, the young, impressionable children were impressioned. The second group were most severely affected. For example, after just 2 sessions with 5-year-old Norma, Tudor said that it was very difficult to get her to speak, even though she spoke a lot just a month before. 9-year-old Betty would practically refuse to talk and held hand or arm over eyes most of the time. Even 15-year-old Hazel Potter became much more conscious of herself and talked less than before. She would say the sound A more and snap her fingers out of frustration because she was afraid of saying the next word. All of their schoolwork was also drastically impacted, and some even started refusing to recite in class. One child, Clarence, would start correcting himself before even saying it, telling people that he's going to have trouble on the next word. One orphan grew so withdrawn that she stopped talking to her best friend almost completely and ran away from the orphanage 2 years later. Some retained these negative effects for the rest of their lives. Even Tudor came to see the horrifying effects the study was having on the children, and after the 6-month-long experiment ended, she returned to the orphanage several times out of her own accord to try and reverse the effects she had caused. Vulnerable orphan children were deliberately subjected to ruthless abuse simply for research. Healthy kids were lied to and almost bullied into developing speech problems and emotional trauma, as the researchers ignored all ethical responsibility they had, especially on developing children without any stable figures in their life. It seems so obviously exploitative, but apparently Johnson didn't think so before conducting the monster study. Officially, he never published the research, whether out of embarrassment or shame, we don't know. But the University of Iowa was famous for speech problems, and many researchers visited it, so it was sort of an open secret among them. More than 60 years after the experiment was conducted, in 2001, an investigative reporter found these results after reading Mary Tudor's thesis in the basement of the University of Iowa. He was obviously horrified and wrote a series of articles on it and reached out to the test subjects. They revealed that they had several long-lasting psychological effects. They actually did not know until then that they were being experimented on, and had actually believed that they were stutterers, and because of that, they were withdrawn in life. In the end, the study failed to prove anything at all. There were no noticeable effects on the other experimental group, while the second group were affected severely. None of them became stutterers either, but their personality changed as they became more reserved and self-conscious of the way they talk. The surviving children filed a lawsuit against the state of Iowa. For the plaintiffs, we hope and believe it will help provide closure relating to experiences from long ago into memories going back almost 70 years. For all parties, it ends long-running, difficult, and costly litigation that only would have run up more expenses and delayed resolution to plaintiffs who are in their 70s and 80s. They were eventually awarded a total of $925,000 to be split among the 7 surviving orphan children for lifelong psychological and emotional scars caused by the monster study. And alright guys, that wraps up some disturbing psychological experiments. If you enjoyed this video, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know, and it helps me, keep making videos like this. And comment down below if you'd like to see more videos like this. I really love the feedback. I read every single comment. I appreciate you watching. You guys are the best. This was Snook, and I'll see you next time. Bye.